silver from the north of Spain, a locket that bears the name of the man that Brandy loves. He came on a summer's day, bringing gifts from far away, but he made it clear he couldn't stay. Today we get to talk with Jim Chapman. Jim has been a professional musician for almost 60 years, having played with Rockabilly King Ronnie Hawkins and opened for international acts like Sly and the Family Stone and Ocean. He was a very popular radio and TV talk show host and newspaper and magazine columnist in London, Ontario for a quarter of a century before retiring in 2017. He has written several books, both fiction and nonfiction, including the one that caught my attention, Come Back to Life, about his near-death experience at the age of 50. I also understand he is a collector car fan and has an extensive collection of rare and vintage musical instruments. Jim, welcome to Two Old Guys Talking.
Well, thank you, Two Old Guys Talking. One old guy on this end, too.
the three of us now.
I've heard the word retirement used in conjunction with your name in the past, Jim, and I still don't believe it.
Well, let's say the difference between previous retirements and this one is that I don't have a paycheck coming from anywhere now.
Yeah. Okay. So what are you doing with your time now?
Well, I've written another book over the past year, and Carlin and I have sold our house and are getting ready to move to another one. So that's been another 4-month project to get that ready. You know, all the crap that we had, John. You've been to our house and seen the house full of stuff. The new house actually is smaller than my current garage. So it's a major downsize project for us.
Oh, that is Paul. Jim's house is one of the old South properties that are more of the manse type thing, like they're just like an enormous property, and yeah, it was jam packed full with lots of interesting memorabilia and stuff. Yeah, I'm glad I'm not you. Holy smokes!
I'm out here in Vancouver, Jim, but I actually grew up in London. That's how I know John.
Well, I'm not going to hold that against you, knowing John, and I know Vancouver's lovely. I have lots of friends here.
Jim, when I was researching some information about your life, I'm wondering, you've done so many things, is it reasonable for me to sort of broadly categorize it into rock and roll and journalism?
Well, I think maybe with a slice of business in there, yeah. Right. I dropped out of high school to pursue a rock and roll career, and I did that on and off for 30 years, and then came back later and did it some more. But along the way, I ran an advertising agency. I owned and ran a 24-track recording studio and a band management company with a couple of partners. And then in the 90s, or very late 80s, early 90s, I got through a really interesting set of circumstances, unusual set of circumstances. I ended up in the radio business, and then that expanded into television, and that expanded into writing columns for the local newspaper, for the Free Press, and then to Business London magazine for many years, and then London Inc. magazine, and finally retired from all. You know, for me, the whatever I did had to be fun, because I made a decision pretty early in my life that once I got over the delusion that I would be a rock and roll star someday, which happened before I was out of my teens, I realized that wasn't going to happen, but I could have a very rewarding career as a professional musician. And once I decided that's what I was going to do, as opposed to going back to school, my parents really wanted me to be a lawyer, and I had some inclination in that direction, but I made a decision in when I was 21 or 22 that I wanted to be happy in my working life, because that's the easiest way, I thought, or the most likely to make sure you're happy in your overall life. And to that end, I said, I'm going to try as much as I can, never to work at a job that I don't like. And I have been absolutely blessed through my lifetime that, except for a moment here and a moment there, you know, a bad day here and a bad day there, I can truthfully say that my entire working life was spent doing things I wanted to do. It wasn't easy along the way in terms of, you know, keeping your eye on the prize. There were times when I had opportunities to take, a couple of times to take high-paying jobs that I somehow obliquely was qualified for, but I didn't take them because they didn't offer me the opportunity to get up every morning and be glad to go to work. And and there have been long times in my life too when I didn't have a job working for somebody else. Like most of my life, I worked for myself. Even when I was in broadcasting, I was a freelance guy. I brought my own programming, and in a lot of cases, got my own sponsors and did all that stuff. So there was a lot of work there. There was a lot of work involved, but it was great fun. And at the end of almost every day, I could sit there and say, you know, this was another good day I had.
Back in your in the early days of your rock and roll career, you were a bassist. Is that it?
Yeah, I started playing bass. Very rare for guys in my era. That was 1963. I actually started playing bass. Most bass players then, and I suspect now probably too, start out as frustrated guitar players. Oh. Or in my case, three of my friends formed a band, and we had been just kind of goofing around prior to that a little bit, but I hadn't really done very much. And they formed a band and said, we'd like to have you join the band, but what am I going to, I don't really play anything at this point. Well, if you can learn to play bass, you're in the band. So I bought a bass and learned to play it and ended up in the band. But most of my peers, particularly from that period, were guys that started out playing guitar and either had to switch to bass to get a job, or because they thought there was more work there. And in those days, there was a lot of work for bass.
I'm curious what you think. I mean, there hasn't been a rock and roll supergroup in a long time, because musicians these days are producing their music with digital audio workstations, basically solo on their own. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I did that myself back in the 1980s. I had a music production company, and I did a lot of songs for a radio station in town, for CFPL. They hired me to write comedy songs for their morning show. And I did that for about 3 years. And out of that grew an opportunity to write and perform a lot of songs for commercially. I did a lot of jingles. I did a lot of specialty songs. People would hire me to write a birthday song for their Uncle Fred, and I, you know, write and record this. And at that point, I had a studio in the attic of my house, nice studio up there, and I played and sang virtually all the parts on all that stuff. 2 or 3 times I had people come in to sing a particular harmony line or something, but basically I did it all. But it was a lot tougher than today in terms of, you know, in those days, you didn't have all the electronic stuff you have now. You couldn't bounce tracks. You couldn't edit electronically. You couldn't correct anything. You know, if you played a bad note, you had to go back and fix it or sang one. So I have great respect for the guys who do all that stuff today, but most of the keyboard tracks that you hear are program tracks, and the drums are all program tracks. And so if you do that right, you can have amazing results. But to me, there's just, and I guess I'm just an old fogey, but a lot of the new stuff lacks that spark of reality, I guess I would call it. It sounds to me like it's programmed and processed. And that's no reflection on the quality of the performer or even of the music, of the quality of the songs. It's just, there's something missing for me.
A different kind of energy than, say, when you
were... I think that's bang on the money. That's exactly what it is. It seems to me to be much less emotional, kind of off the cuff than what we played back. And, you know, I was just listening the other day, Wednesday, there to some old tapes that I had made many years ago, cleaning up around the house, packing things, and I found these old tapes, so I popped them in, and some of them were kind of rough around the edges in terms of the sonic quality and things like that the guys take take for granted today. Just push a button and your voice sounds just as good as it's ever going to sound, literally at the push of a button on the right piece of machinery. We didn't have that in those days, but I'm listening to some of the performances of a couple of the bands I was in and some of my recording stuff, and it's the emotion is palpable. I mean, it's right in front of you. It's crawling into your ears, the emotion of these performances. And I don't think that a lot of the more modern stuff today quite captures that. There's some incredible players, incredible production, all of that stuff out there. But at the end of the day, I still prefer, in most cases, to see a guy or a couple or three people sit down and just kind of woodshed among themselves, you know, play for real, sing for real. And if they're good, if they're talented, you can't beat that. You just can't beat it.
Jim, do you think that's a byproduct where we'd point at the artist, or is it the industry? It's like movies. It's very much a formula now. Like, and it's like applying for a mortgage. You like if you don't fit the algorithm, you don't get to play. And that once in a while we do get that artist that comes out. Like I feel the same. I'm almost hesitant to critique, because there's always that historically, well, as you said, fuddy-duddy or whatever back in my day thing. But I think they've lost a lot more freedom now than they were able to have. Like at one point, I think in the 60s, they were actually looking for somebody who sounded differently. Now they're looking for people who sound the same.
Well, because that's where the money is. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Go back to the very early days of rock and roll, for example, but roll recording too. But let's just talk about rock and roll. That's what I'm most familiar with, or country too. In the early days, the purpose of recording someone was to capture what they sounded like live. So someone went to see you play in a club. Oh, gee, I like that guy. Well, that guy, he's thinking, boy, if I had a record. And the small record companies like Sam Phillips with Sun Records, which is probably the best known example, but the woods were full of them. Guys who had their own little studios, had their own little record cutting. They could master them right there. And then they'd send them off to a record manufacturing plant and literally have them back overnight. There's all kinds of stories of the early days of rock and roll where they cut a song on like Tuesday night, and by Thursday it's being played over half the country. And that was no electronic trance, nothing. That was moving physical product all over the place, but they had a system to do that.
The original self-publishers.
Well, exactly. But as the business got bigger, as the money started to flow, the smart guys, the smart money guys, they figured out there was a better way to do things. And so if you had a hit, if this was a hit record, chances about 50-50 that your next one's going to sound very much the same. If the money guys are running the show, which they almost always did. And you look back at any of the famous bands from the 50s or early 60s and look at how many similar songs they recorded that sounded kind of the same way. Now today, they've taken that to the nth extreme. They've maximized the effectiveness recording-wise for any instrument you can think of. And again, push the button on the little box, and the sound, the sonic qualities of that sound are going to be reproduced endlessly. So all the guitars sound the same, all the basses sound the same, all the drums sound the same. There might be a couple different models there, but basically all the same stuff. So you can, and they use the same levels of reverb, they use the same levels of bounce back, all of the technical stuff, they've got it down. So we've got the best sounds from all of this stuff. But the problem is, when you start plugging the guys in to play and sing it, everything sounds the same.
I think it's partially just the evolution of music. Big band, rock and roll, electronic dance music. And now you actually played rockabilly with Ronnie Hawkins, and you opened for Sly and the Family Stones and Ocean. That's pretty big, right?
Yeah, I had a couple of interesting stages on which I played at times. Yeah, and the difference in all three of those bands are good examples of the way things used to be at different levels. Ronnie's bands were always as tight as they could possibly be. He would almost literally whip you to get you to practice. But once you had it down, once you understood the way that music works. And a lot of people think that not jazz, but rock and roll and country, oh, it's so simple. Anybody can play that. It's all simple crapola. Not at all. I mean, anybody can hack their way through it. And you can go to any bar in any city on any Thursday night and hear guys hacking their way through almost anything you can think of. But to play that music right, simply, tightly, the holes in the right places, no holes where there shouldn't be holes, that's hard to do. Unless you're a solo guitar player, you need to play in a band, and that's where the wheels come off for a lot of players. I watch these, I don't even know what they're called now, The Voice, or You Want to Be a Star, or whatever, American, all these things. And I watch those people on there, and I'm very impressed by almost all of them, except that it's gone off to the technical side where you can literally, and I mean literally, make anybody sound good. If you got the gear and the knowledge, it doesn't matter how bad a singer you are, they can make you sound like, well, Lady Gaga, again, who's a favorite of mine. And the other side, the guys who are really focusing on the playing, on making the sounds. They don't let the equipment make the sounds for them.
They're two different skill sets.
Absolutely, yes, they are. And neither one of them is just a narrow niche. I mean, they both have a lot of range within them, but the best guitar players I know, the best players that I play with in London, and I would say this, and a lot of people are going to roll their eyes except the musicians won't. There are players in London, Ontario, and in any city this size and smaller towns across the world who can play every bit as well as the biggest superstar recording sold a gajillion records guys in the world that you want to think of. That's a reality of the business. You know, one of the very finest guitar players I've ever seen in my life is a guy named Jerry Fletcher. Jerry has a guitar and an amp. No foot pedals, no stuff on his amp, no nothing. And he is an awesome player. Country player, jazz player, rock and roll, just awesome. But it's all talent. It all comes from his head to his hands, through the guitar, through the amp, and there it is. And there are other guys in London, a guy named Chet Risser, who's also an amazing, amazing guitar player. Now, Chet uses a little bit of stuff on his amp, but not a whole lot. And most of what he does is in his brain, and in his fingers. Those are the guys that I think are the future, I hope, of music, if it has one. If the technocrats haven't already won, then those are the guys that I look to for the future, the guys that are inspiring younger guys to say, instead of, gee, how soon can I get that new fuzz pedal? And instead of saying that, gee, how soon can I learn that particular lick that I want to be able to play? But that's a battle that's ongoing, and nobody knows what the end product of that will be. What else? I'll say that one more thing about this, because I think this is really important. And I don't mean to upset or denigrate anybody who's a music fan, but I will say this, having been in the business for more than 60 years now on stage, I would say that the majority of listeners out there know what they like, and God bless them, good for them, you should. You know, they know what they like, but they don't know good from bad on the best day. They really don't, because they're not trained. They don't, they don't have skills. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have the understanding. There's nothing wrong with that in a consumer society, because they want to consume the finished product. So if they've got a band that they really like, then that's the best band in the world, right? Well, in fact, in many, many, many cases, from a musician's point of view, and I don't mean trained like symphony, I just mean somebody who's got some talent and spent a lifetime developing it. The audiences are not very discriminating about what they like and don't like. And what that leads to then, unfortunately, is a lot of really good players who don't get a shot at the big time because whatever they're playing doesn't fit that desire on the part of the audience. It's just, I don't know about that. He's not very good, is he? No, he might be really good. You can't tell the difference. And I'm not saying that to insult anyone, but the reality is that a lot of the music business is, and always has been, driven by people who don't know squat about music They just know what they like. And that's perfectly fine until people start translating that over into, well, I like this guy, therefore he's better than that guy. And that's a word I hate. You see these things on YouTube all the time. You know, who's the best band? Who's the best guitar player? Who's the best? And it's absolute nonsense. And I usually, although I try not to do anything on Facebook, I usually respond and say something like, who are you kidding? How can you? There's no way. There's no answer to that question. There is no greatest guitar player. Because for every guy who comes along and says, well, it's Eric Clapton. Another guy comes along and says, well, it was Lenny Bro. And another guy comes along and says, no, it was Keith Richards. And no, it was Roy Buchanan. All of these, it's pointless. But people get stuck in that. And I think overall, I think it's very bad, particularly for live music, because there are music venues in this city where when they were operating, they're not now, but we hope they'll be back. When you could go on a Friday night and see a band that would just blow your doors off, not only because they were fun and you liked the music, but because they were really good players. And the crowd goes, yay, love you guys. And the next week you go to the same bar. And believe me, I've seen this happen many times. You go in the next week and the band is just awful. Should never play in public, but they play songs that people like, and yay, you guys are great. And that goes on and on. So for a musician, a playing musician who has worked hard to reach a certain level of performance and values that and values the music, that gets a little frustrating. And we see that writ large in the recording industry now, where you very seldom see one of the top bands now. If you see them live, they've either got an extra 6 people on stage and $500,000 worth of sound processing gear. You go, well, that's okay, but you know that you're no better than the guy down around the corner last week on the weekend at the bar. And songs may be great songs. Pretty much got to have a great song to have hit. But that whole business about the business frustrates me and frustrates a whole lot of people like me who came up the hard way and couldn't push a button. And we used to joke about the talent module when I was younger. Say you blow apart in rehearsal or something. So I got to get a talent module to fix that. Well, now they literally have a talent module. You plug the instrument into that thing and it's hooked into the computer. You play a wrong note, it fixes it automatically. You sing a wrong note, it fixes that automatically. Nobody's any the wiser. And you walk away sounding like you were a virtuoso, when in fact the virtuosity came from the talent module. And the sad thing is it's too old for guys like me because we can't use them anymore.
You just used the phrase "came up the hard way," Jim, and this is a little bit of a segue into a different area that I want to talk about, because I've been a fan of you for a long time, and in part it was because you gave me an opportunity to be on your show when you had the Talk of the Town, I think.
Talk of the Town.
Yeah.
Well, you added. May I say, John, you added a great deal to that show, and that's why you were there.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. But the other part of my admiration for you is you came up in a time that, and I did too, where, if you came out of high school, you had to have a career path. You worked at Labatt's, or that's what our parents encouraged us to do, was sort of the
for sure. Yeah.
But you were not wired that way, and you've never been throughout your life. You've taken like the music thing. I think the current equivalent would be kids who want to be a professional gamer or a programmer, and that sort of thing. But and then you moved on to a different thing, but you made it work each time, and that's not unique, but it's rare. And so I don't know whether you can answer this from a personal perspective on why Jim Chapman was able to do that, but have you ever reflected on why such a small percentage of our society is able to go outside of the box and make it work? Because most never venture, and most that do fail. And you not only succeeded, you did it in different venues.
Well, you're very kind to say that, John. Thank you. I appreciate it. And it's a good question. I'll do my best to answer it for you, because I have thought about this in my own life. Particularly, I'm 72 now, and I've had some health issues, and so at that age, you start, at least for me, I started revisiting the past on occasion. not living back there, but just going back to pleasant memories more than anything, right? And I talked this over with Carlin, with my wife, a couple of times, and I think, with reference to your particular question, I think for me, if I look back at all the different things I did, which was to be a backup musician, to front my own band, to buy and run a recording studio, to run an advertising agency, to work for the London Tigers baseball team for a season, which was a real highlight in my career, as their marketing and promotions guy. That was just a hoot, an absolute hoot. And then I got into the radio business, and I got into writing for free. All of those things, there's a common denominator in every one of them. And that is that at the moment when I had to step on the stage, pick up a microphone, whatever it was, I had a confidence that I could do it. I never thought ever in my life, have I ever thought, oh, I'm really good, I can do this, no problem. What I had instead was, okay, I have this opportunity, I've done my homework, I've researched what's involved in doing whatever this activity is. I practiced, more practice was possible. And at the moment of truth, every single job I ever had that was that kind, a couple of little jobs, but every major job I ever had, there was a moment when, okay, big shot, now's the time to, put up or shut up. Right. And at that moment, in every one of those jobs, I had confidence that I could put up enough to do the job. I never thought ever that I was going to be great at anything, because I'm not a great person. We all know people who I think are great people, and they can do this and they do it surpassingly well. And some of them can do another things surpassingly well, and other than just, these are great, brilliant people. I never saw myself that way. What I saw myself as was my father, a generation along. My father was worked for Christie Bread Company for most of his life. And driving the truck, dropping off the bread, all that sort of stuff. Eventually became a manager, but that was later in his career. The thing that my dad taught me was you do everything that you do to the best of your ability, and chances are that's going to be better than 95% of the guys around you, because most people, it's just kind of a job's a job and you get through it. He lived his whole life like that. And so here am I a generation later without his intellect. He grew up in the Depression, so that wasn't an issue to me. Making a good living was never really, that wasn't a motivator for me. If I made money, that was great, but if I didn't, that wasn't about. And I think as I look back at all those various things that I've done, that is the common thread, is that I felt at the moment of truth, to use that term again, that I can do this. Even when people said, you can't do that, and I heard that a lot in my career. You can't do that, you can't make that happen, you can't be on the radio, you can't do a talk show, you can't write a newspaper column, you can't do all these things. And every time I heard that, or some version of that, or sensed that, I just thought of my dad and said, well, Dad just said, do the best you can, son, be as prepared as you can be, do the best you can, and you're probably going to come up pretty close to the top. I don't know how close to the top I got, but I certainly did well in all my various careers. So I hope that wasn't too long-winded, but
no, it's not.
Think that really is it. And if there's a message for anybody that I would share with anybody, is believe in yourself. Not just because of, you look in the mirror, oh, there I am, oh, I believe in it. Not because of that, because you're ready, you're prepared, you're trained, you've done it to yourself, you've made yourself.
That's what I would drill down on that point, because believing in yourself that's just words. And I like the distinction you made between those people who are just naturals. They can't fail. It just comes to them. But that would be the nature versus nurture argument. And I would say that the nurture, whatever influence our parents had on us, but also just the fact, I want to do this, I'm going to learn everything I can about this, and and then I can take the mic and say, I can do this, because you did the nurture part. But it's not a matter of just stepping up to the mic and then winging it, because that will fall apart pretty quick.
Well, as we see now with the proliferation of people on
Yep.
all the media, not just social media, but on the major networks and stuff too, some of the people working on those, they have no business being there. They don't know what they're doing. They really don't. I see them every day. As an old newsman, I watch a lot of these new newsmen on the major networks, and it's pathetic. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the purpose. What I think the purpose is to inform people. What they were trying to do is inform people about their own opinions and convince them to follow
They
their.
want clicks. That's what they're looking. Paul and I have talked about this in the past, where in our generation was one thing, but now with the advent of the internet and social media and just the sheer population on the planet, that you're going to find an audience for pretty much anything, but it's as likely, if not more likely, that I refer to the social media as being a petri dish for stupidity and ignorance as much as knowledge. And
Yeah.
but it is frustrating for those of us that came up and we kind of saw the like what it took to find an audience. But like probably the population of this planet is twice now what it was when we started our careers.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there are so many people out there now who, and I don't know whether it's generational. I don't know whether it's helicopter parents or millennials or Generation Z or all that stuff. I really don't pay that much attention to that part of the world anymore. I'm too old. I'm too tired. I'm too ornery. I don't care about all that stuff because I can't fix it, and it doesn't really affect my life that much at this point in my life. But somewhere along the line, between my generation and my nephew's kids' generation, somewhere along there, and that's not just three like him, me, and his kid. There's 5 or 6 generations in there in terms of distinct behavioral patterns and so on. When I look back, something went wrong somewhere, and some people will say, well, it's because the helicopter parents, they hovered over their kids. They wouldn't let them grow up, and they wouldn't let them fail. Everybody got a participation trophy and all of that stuff. And it's easy and maybe a little facile to say, well, sure, that's what it was. They never learned to lose and so on and so on.
It's got to be a part of it, though. It's got to be a part.
For sure it does. For sure it does. The question in my mind of all this is, how big a part is it? And nobody knows. And anybody, I would submit, anybody who says they know what's happened is full of baloney. They don't. Nobody knows what happened, really. You can look at it and say, and this is what I've always liked. They say, my little Johnny, he wasn't doing well in school, and we looked at it. We figured out it was because the other kids weren't inviting him to play sports with them, and he wanted to play sports. And so we told the teacher, and the teacher put him on the team, and he got to bat with the other kids, even though he couldn't swing a bat. And at the end of the game, nobody won. Everybody got a trophy. Everybody went home. And boy, was Johnny ever happy about that. And I can relate to that because in many ways, I was Johnny in school when it came to sports. My parents would never have called anybody to say, let Jim do this or make him do that, because in those days you didn't do that. But I remember very clearly how disappointing and discouraging it was to be that kid. So in that sense, I look at the parents doing every kid's a winner. I see the value in that, except when that kid grows up, the world isn't like that. The world does not see everybody as a winner. Generally speaking, with some strokes of luck not to be discounted, but generally speaking, people get as far as they're willing to go. They get as far as they have the intelligence and the drive and the ability and the luck to go. It's not like everybody gets a participation trophy. There are no participation trophies in life. And at the root of many, many, many of the problems that we're having today, I see some version of that. So you had something that started out, I think, with the best of intentions. We don't want little Johnny to feel bad, because nobody wants your kid to feel bad. If you're a kid, you don't want to feel bad. And I completely understand it, and right there. But move on down the line. Now you got at least 2 generations now, little Johnnies who can't comprehend that the world isn't fair, can't comprehend that a better life isn't just sitting there waiting for them. And then spin off in all sorts of other directions and get involved in all sorts of other political activism and a whole lot of stuff that to me kind of misses the point. You know, if you get, I was raised to believe that you look after your family and you look after your neighbors. And if you do those two things, things are going to go just about as well as you can hope for them to go. You really can't do much more than that. Well, today, sorry, John.
I would, sorry, Jim, for interrupting. I think the precursor to, like, I hear what you're saying, because when that started with our human children, it started in the dog world as well. You got to be all positive all the time, ignore bad behavior. Since then, you have, and the argument being that if you're not, you'll increase aggression and anxiety, and the exact opposite has happened in both categories. But I've wondered about this, and I can't say that it's because our standard of living has increased. I think it's because, and I think this, if you look at this globally, it would bear it out, at least anecdotally, that it's the amount of spare time people have to believe they're special. We didn't have that time before. We just, your mom and dad were busy all the time. They sent you out. You came back when the lights went out, and you took your knocks all the way through. But now that there's so much spare time, and then you've got it further fed by the because the algorithms of the internet that lead to you only get to the people who agree with your either your a rational, critically thought out argument or just nonsense. That has led into these avenues of behavior and belief, like you know, the Pareto principle. That sort of what was this? I think is an Italian economist. He did some research where he found out that 80% of the land in Italy was owned by 20% of the populace, and that 20/80 rule is something that we've run across in business and
oh yes, many times,
right. But I think if we looked at our overall population, 20% of them are doing the critical thinking, and the 80% are being dragged along. But the
I'm not sure I'd even agree with 20%. I think 10% might be, and even lower. Carl and I were talking last night about, and my sister was over here, and we talk about, stuff. And we were talking about the political failure in this country. We have an election now, and I don't know what your politics are, and quite frankly, I don't care anybody's politics. I'm not even sure what mine are, but I observe that if I were a non-partisan, totally objective person, if it's often to be such, and I were to look at the political history of this country, of Canada, over the last 72 years that I've been on, I would come to the inescapable conclusion that this country has been run by idiots and poltroons 95% of the time. And how did that happen? How did we have a society that was so inept at being a society that we repeatedly elected again, and whatever, pick your party, I don't care, elected people that A, lied to us from the beginning, B, that we knew were lying from the beginning, C, that we would elect and they would not come through, their lies would become reality, D, we'd vote for them again. By the next election, generally, we're kind of fed up with their lies and with their non-performance. So we willy-nilly go to the next pretty face we see, or a nice haircut, or sharp suit, or whatever, glib tongue, whatever it is. And we do the same thing with them. So another 10 years go by of incredible ineptitude at virtually every level. I would challenge anyone who sees this video ever to prove me wrong on that. Prove me that the government in this country in the last even 50 years could honestly be said to have acted in the best interests of most of the people most of the time. Because you can't do it. Nobody can do it, because that's not what happens. So anyway, we're talking, my sister said, well, why do you think that is? I said, I think it's the Peter principle. Lawrence J. Peter was a business writer and a bunch of other things. And he wrote a book called Peter Principle back in the 70s, maybe. And his premise was that we're all good at something, and we're all good at something to a certain level, but we're not all good at everything at every level. And in a practical sense, it means that you take a guy who gets out of school, gets a job as a salesman. And he's not very good when he starts, but he watches the people around him. He gets better, he gets better, he gets better. He really gets good at being salesman. Okay. His boss looks at him and says, well, here's a sharp guy, smart guy, become one of our best salesmen, making us lots of money. It's time we moved him upstairs. Let's make him a sales manager. All right. Make him a sales manager. God, he's even better. He's even better because all of his sales training and understanding human nature and so on, that's great when you're trying to motivate a team of salesmen under you, particularly because at that point, relative point in your lives, you're going to be probably a better salesman than any of them. So he's a great success again. Boy, this is the company's revenues are increasing and so on and so on. Now, the owners of the company who know nothing about anything that makes the country work or makes the company work, but they're the owners. They have the money, they have the investment. And as far as they can see, their investment's done really well. And it's done really well because of, well, let's call this guy Peter, because of Peter. Wow, Peter's done a great job as a salesman. He turned the company around. The manager, well, we're just rocking. We've got the general manager's position is open to run all of the operations in this company. And who better than Peter to look at his track record? So they put Peter into that job where understanding of human nature is not nearly as important as it is at the sales level. Organizing people to go out and deliver a message that you're prefabbing for them, which is what a lot of sales is. That's different again. Managing individuals doing something that you know all about. So you're the manager, you're the sales manager, not the salesman, but you know everything the salesmen are doing. Now they're going to move you one step up where you don't know any of that stuff. And what happens? Well, Peter said that 90% of the time those guys fail, but they don't get fired. Because in the structure, the capitalist structure, and I'm a big capitalist, but the structure of the capitalist system, you don't want to throw people out when they prove to be incompetent once they reach a certain level, because that then reflects on you. If the guy you hired was incompetent, what does that say about you? So you've got a big corporation, a big company, or even a smaller one, or a city administration, and those guys reach that level where they can't do the job anymore. So everybody's performance starts to go down. What do you do with that guy? Well, you kick him upstairs. You give him a nice office and a fancy title, and he doesn't do any more work. Or you move him sideways, and you go and try to find the next savior for your business. Well, multiply that by thousands, millions of enterprises, business, government, organizations, whatever. And what do you come up with? A tiny handful of people who, as you said, are the only ones getting anything done. But worse than that is you've got these people above them and beside them who don't know what they're doing, couldn't do what they were proven they couldn't do what they were doing. You got to get through all of that. And that's where everything stumbles. That's why we don't see, except in very rare occasions, where you see an individual or an idea even just kind of burst down here and build, and keep on building and keep on building and keep on building forever, which is how many of the companies around today, that's how they, particularly ones that are 100, 150 years old, that's how they got moved. It doesn't mean they're going to stay there. But now you've got this incredible mix of all of these people who think that they're every bit as smart and as good looking as anybody on the planet. And they have incredible amounts of not self-derived self-worth, but self-worth that's sort of been stuck on them with a safety pin by their parents. And they get out in the real world, not only can't they do the job they want to do or should do, a whole bunch of the people above them can't do their jobs either. And what do you get? Well, you get where we are now. And I mean, look at it, nothing. If you don't go beyond the national debt of virtually any Western democracy and ask yourself, how did that ever happen? How did anybody ever think that we'll be better off if we're buried in debt up to our ears than trying to actually figure out how to solve the problems of our society without just throwing money at them?
Jim, question for you here with a little preface. So what you're describing with the Peter Principle and these are decisions and perceptions that human beings have. And I always thought that one of the things that sets us aside from animals is that we're all driven without a lack of awareness in most cases with certain evolutionary programs, and we are triggered to do things that we don't realize that we're being triggered to do. But we are the only species that, to my knowledge, that once you become aware of it, you can address it. So, but that requires the ability to think critically and know what a cognitive bias is and logical fallacy. And so, in my reflections on the political situation and this skewed sense of self-worth and all that sort of thing that exists in society, we don't teach critical thinking until post-secondary education, and only in philosophy or the hard sciences. And I've often wondered what would be the impact if our educational system embraced that was introduced on a junior kindergarten level in an appropriate manner, and then it became part of the reading and writing and arithmetic and thinking. Like if that was that, would we be as fooled as a society by political promises once we became aware that, oh, I know why I'm thinking this, but, and that's how they're trying to manipulate me. And even though, like, if we go back to the Pareto principle, which I agree, it's probably not 20-80, but even the people in the 80 would know more than they'd know without that.
Well, I've never been a fan of conspiracy theories, but there is a long-held conspiracy theory that I think is proving itself to be accurate. And that was when I was a young man, a young teenager in school. I wasn't very good generally at school because I didn't care. I was not looking to get a university degree. I didn't think that's where my life was going to take me. I didn't know where, but I thought I'm going to have to survive on my wits, I think. Because I hated school, I couldn't see myself sitting through 4 or 5 or 6 years, whatever, at university. So I started to look around at what the world was as far as I could see and how it worked as far as I could tell. And I very early on came across a book, the name of which will now escape me when I need to remember. And it was written by an educational theorist in the 30s in the United States. And it was not a well-known book at all, poo-poo book by his peers. And his contention was that he didn't put it in these terms, but there was a conspiracy with public education. And that was that initially public education was very valuable because it taught everyone to read. And if you could read, then it opened the entire world up to you. If you couldn't read, you were stuck at one level or facet in a very parochial, very limited life. Mm-hmm. So let's teach them all to read, and let's teach them all to count too, because we might as well, because it's related, And then, let's teach them enough history so that they appreciate what they have today. They appreciate that things are better than they were yesterday, because that's important. You don't want them to be unhappy with their life, all these little kiddies. And we'll teach them a little science in the schools, but we'll wait till they're adults before we really give them much in the sciences. And what else do they need to know? Well, for a little while, the girls need to know how to bake and sew, and the boys need to know how to cut and hammer. So we had home ec and we had shop classes, right? I don't know how many years ago that passed. I'm going to go to limit and say probably the better part of 50 years ago. They stopped doing that generally. And what did they replace that with? Well, a lot of stuff that to me is kind of ancillary to developing a young child. A lot of the social studies and a lot of stuff that would better have been taught when the kids were 16, 17, 18, after having come up through the kind of regimen that you just talked about. And then when they have some critical faculties that understand how their own brains work, understand how the psychology of crowds, the psychology of masses, how that all works. They understand how advertising works. It's not just, there's a burger on TV. I feel like a burger. Let's go get one. Well, we can all relate to that. Yeah. But the three of us know very well that it's much deeper than that, the way that advertising is used to motivate us. And it's so natural to us, we don't even notice it or pay attention to it anymore. The conspiracy theory this guy was saying was, and this, again, this was written in the 30s, was basically there is a movement by the people who control society, whoever they are. Everybody's got one gray group or another that runs them. Doesn't matter. But they really don't want to educate us. So we'll just keep doing what we're doing. And then in the 60s, there was a huge revolution in education. and a lot of very interesting books written by a lot of interesting people saying a lot of interesting things. And we're still seeing the results of that. It's still going on today. You look at in the States where a couple of major jurisdictions now have removed, they're not marking for English and mathematics and science and history. There are no marks for that anymore because people were being offended that their particular worldview wasn't being repeated to their kids in the classroom, or some kids are being left behind because some kids are better at math than others. This is going on in California, and I think Oregon, and there's some others that are looking, but they've already done